Okay, we're going to talk about, I'm going to finish some comments about abortion and then talk about euthanasia. So let's get started with that. As far as abortion is concerned, I downloaded that, or you should have downloaded. I uploaded, I think, right? I uploaded, you downloaded some ideas from that those abortion DVDs. Keep in mind that a lot about abortion is hidden in ignorance. And there are physiological, psychological, and even sociological implications of it. If you do get on the internet and look at some of the pro-choice or pro-abortion people, they're going to say, well, statistically, there's very few infections. Statistically, abortion's one of the safest procedures you can have done, and so on and so forth. Well, maybe so in some respects for the mother, but certainly it's not very safe for the infant. And keep in mind, I gave you those scientific reasons. The main thing I want you to know is that it doesn't make any difference when you end the life, whether it's at 12 weeks, like you saw in the first DVD, a so-called early abortion, or a later abortion, or partial birth abortion, or infanticide, or killing of handicapped children, or on the other end of the spectrum, the elderly, and so forth. There is no difference. And once we head down the slippery slope of losing the sanctity of human life, there is no limitation. Will euthanasia or even infanticide be legal in the United States? Quite possibly, especially now that we have a nice door open to it called national health care, okay? Or Obamacare, as a lot of people like to call it. I gave you those reasons that a human being is what? Indistinguishable. Okay? The unborn child is indistinguishable from any other human being. The only thing needed is time and nutrition. From the moment of conception, all of the DNA is there, everything necessary to become a fully functioning human being is present. And as hopefully you noticed from those DVDs, it's not about the science, is it? What is it about? Money. That one doctor said he performed sometimes 30 abortions in one day. That's unbelievable. Okay, working at 2 clinics, probably going from one to the other, going from patient to patient and so forth. Unbelievable. So it's really not a matter of when does life begin. Of course, there was a lot of criticism for any time you have an anti-abortion DVD put out, and many of the persons arguing against that, saying, oh, it's really not that bad, and that's just all made to look bad. Well, of course they made it to look bad. That was the purpose. Many people say that the so-called fetus cannot feel pain until 24 weeks. Well, how in the world can you determine that? Whereas you can see on the ultrasound or on in the second DVD that the child is moving, heartbeat almost doubling. Okay, so that is ridiculous. It's all trying to excuse what you saw was actually going on. All right, so what is legal in the United States? Basically, you can have an abortion at any time for any reason. The restrictions do vary from state to state, but they're constantly being challenged in the Supreme Court. When a state tries to put restrictions on it, everybody gets all up in arms about women's rights and so forth. And of course, partial birth abortions, there's no statistics available on those. President Bush put a ban on fetal tissue research and put a ban on partial birth abortions, but of course both of those were lifted by President Obama when he took office, or not much later than that. So the restrictions and the legality of abortions, basically there aren't any restrictions on abortion. All right, so today then I want to take you to the next step after abortion. What is the next step? It's of course called euthanasia. And the roots of euthanasia is where we're going to begin. Euthanasia is very much tied to evolution. So the first root of euthanasia is that it is a logical conclusion if you believe in evolution. According to evolution, man is not a special creation of God. According to evolution, it's all about survival of the fittest. Man is nothing more than a higher animal struggling to survive. So it's just, in their mind, if you're an evolutionist, it just falls with the idea of evolution. It's perfectly logical that you would want to help evolution along. How would we help evolution along? Eliminating what? The weaker members of society. People that are a so-called burden to society. Why not just help things along and so forth? What does evolution lead to logically? It leads to euthanasia. It leads to what we call genocide. All right? It leads to what Hitler did during World War II. Okay? Purification of a particular race. Evolution is very racist. Charles Darwin's book was blatantly racist. Okay? Especially his second book called The Descent of Man. So euthanasia is very closely tied with the idea of evolution. It makes sense if you take what evolution really is and what it means and where it leads to. It is to help evolution along by eliminating weaker members of society. Who would that be? Unwanted children, right? Handicapped children, mentally handicapped people, and the elderly. It's just logical when you look at it from that standpoint. So euthanasia is rooted primarily in evolution. It is a logical result of believing in evolution. Of course, that doesn't make it right, but it is very closely tied to evolution. The second thing, as far as our roots of euthanasia, is that it is directly related to the shift in worldview. Remember, we have decades in our country of rejecting God and the Bible. We don't even have a theistic worldview anymore, let alone a biblical worldview. Remember, what is a biblical worldview? It hinges on the fact that the Bible is the key to understanding the world around us. Not only, of course, do we believe in God, the God of the Bible, but we base our beliefs on the Bible. That's the biblical worldview. Okay, but we don't even have a theistic worldview anymore where we believe God is the sovereign creator. Okay, so it is related to the shift in worldview. No longer do we have a theistic worldview, a respect for God at least, and a respect for the Bible. We have decades of rejecting God and the Bible, and then of course embracing evolution. What were the two results? What are the two results of this shift in worldview in our country? What are they?
No limit to man's depravity.
No limit to man's depravity. And the first one? Yes.
Devaluation of human life.
Devaluation of human life. And of course then, euthanasia is directly related to the fact that we don't value human life anymore. Both of those ideas kind of play a role in euthanasia. No limit to man's depravity, that kind of has the idea of sin and crime. but also we have a devaluation of human life, okay? And what's happening in our country now is that death is a treatment option for terminally ill patients, especially in the state of Oregon. How many of you remember the news of a woman named Brittany Maynard? That's 2004, okay? So we have a devaluation of human life. Physicians are supposed to be in the healing business, right? Not the killing business, no matter how they try to justify it. Okay, so the roots of euthanasia, very, very directly tied to what? Evolution. And of course, the second idea, it's a big part of our shift in worldview. It certainly is related to the idea of the devaluation of human life. Okay, and so what happens when we don't have a proper view of man and we don't value human life? Our natural selfishness takes over, right? And then we're going to have abortion for convenience sake. If we were to go back to abortion for just a minute, 93% of women who had abortions did it for convenience reasons. Can't afford the baby, not married, too young, okay? What is that? Selfishness, the me generation. All right, so we have selfishness, we have convenience, we have expense, we have no honor for our parents, okay? And then we even have misguided people who think they're doing good by legalizing assisted suicide and promoting abortion and so forth. All right, so those are the roots of euthanasia. Next, what is a proper view of death? What is a proper view of death from the Bible? Do you have a biblical worldview? Okay, a proper view of death and even life. The first thing I want to talk about is that life and death are in God's hands, right? We said that a proper view of God, I'm not going to go back to that, but all of what we talked about in the first lecture is important. What is a proper view of God? God is our sovereign creator, right? Not just our creator. We're not deists that God created and then took his hands off and he's impersonal. Life and death are in God's hands because God is sovereign. Okay, so you need to view it that way. Life and death are in God's hands. Whether we're talking about God being the giver of life, but God is also the taker of life. What does the Bible say? It says it's appointed unto men, what? Wants to die. So whether we want to think about it or not, or like it or not, we all have an appointment with death. Isn't that scriptural? Okay, and so we want to base our life and death decisions on God's will, not our own will or our own convenience, etc. So what is a proper view of death and of course life? First of all, life and death are in God's hands. God is sovereign. Secondly, God is the giver and taker of life. Whether we're talking about the idea of having children, having abortion, not having abortion, why abortion's wrong, or we're talking about euthanasia. Both ends of the spectrum. God is the giver and taker of life. So having children should be in God's hands, and of course, death should be in God's hands. A third idea, we should seek God's will in life and death circumstances in our lives. Sometimes you might have to make a decision. You might have to make a decision with regard to a severely injured relative. You might have to make a decision with regard to your own parents. Okay, so it's important that we seek God's will in life and death circumstances or life and death decisions. Okay, and then next, if you have a biblical worldview, and I hope you do, then there are absolutes. We don't have to fumble around with a life or death decision. There are absolutes. Remember, if you have even a theistic worldview, morality and truth is not relative. It's absolute. So there are two absolutes. And in my own mind, I have two lines that I think should never be crossed. When you're making a decision with regard to your parents, maybe someday, one of your parents, or if you have to make a decision with regard to a relative on life support, there are two lines that you never want to cross with regard to the sanctity of human life. The first line is the line of God's authority. Who's the giver and taker of life? Should never cross the line of God's authority. Who decides what's right and wrong? If you have a biblical worldview, who decides what's right and wrong? God does, as revealed in the Bible, right? So then the next step is, who decides who lives and dies? God does, okay? So kind of have a choice. And maybe more and more in our country, I don't know where it's headed. Who's going to decide who lives and dies? God, or some medical ethics board, or some insurance company, okay? So the first line that should never be crossed is the line of God's authority. God is the giver and taker of life. Okay, there are absolutes. There is right and wrong, okay? And so man has no business deciding who lives and who dies. The next line that should never be crossed is the line of destroying human life. So if we're making a life or death decision, we don't overstep God's authority and we don't destroy human life. God is the giver and taker of life. Okay, so the destruction of human life is never ethical at any stage for any reason. You can go round and around with abortion. You can go round and around with assisted suicide. This particular case, look at the circumstances of this particular case. Is that how we make a decision? No, there are absolutes. We don't believe in relativism, right? The Bible reveals things like this. So there are two lines that should never be crossed when making a decision. The line of God's authority and the line of human life. We're going to talk about medical research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about stem cell research, and there's other areas that are going to come up more and more as technology advances. But the question is, you've probably heard the phrase playing God, okay? Does it overstep God's authority, and does it involve the destruction of human life? Either one of those things are pretty straightforward. All right, so there are absolutes. Morality, right and wrong, life and death are not relative. The first line is the line of God's authority. We should never overstep God's authority. It's not up to man to decide who lives or who dies. What about yourself? Okay, what about suicide? Okay, what is suicide according to the Bible? It's sin, okay? And it's a direct result of sin. So even for yourself, which is what the Brittany Maynard case was about versus the Terri Schiavo case in 2005. So we'll talk about those in just a minute. So the roots of euthanasia involve what? Evolution. Killing the unwanted or the handicapped or the weak is a natural result of evolutionary philosophy, okay? Then of course it does involve our shift in worldview and the fact that we don't value human life. Then I want to talk about the progression. How did we get to the point where we have abortion for any reason at any time? And then how did we get to the point where we are talking about the right to die and we're talking about euthanasia more and more? How did we get here? I think there's two reasons that we are already on the slippery slope down, okay, the slippery slope of no value to human life. The first reason is We have no higher law. And this goes back to, we are no longer viewing things through the Bible or even through a theistic worldview. So as far as legality in our country, how did we get here? We recognize, most Americans recognize no higher law. They don't have those absolutes that we just talked about, okay? Because they don't believe God is relevant. They don't respect the Bible. Next, the second reason why we are in the shape that we're in, we're already on the slippery slide into euthanasia, is that we have a change in our legal system over the last, I don't know how many decades. I'm not talking about just recently, but over the last century or even, we have a change in our legal system. All right, we have 3-branch government, correct? We have the executive branch, we have the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And that was all set up to be balanced. We're supposed to have a balance of power. In our country today, we are off balance. Of the 3, which do you think has the least authority and power? The legislature. Who should have the most? The legislature, because they are the most directly responsible to the American people. In our country, we have an executive branch, particularly this administration, that thinks they are above the law and will make, executive orders, they're called, to do just whatever he wants, okay? So our executive branch is well off balance, but even more important and more long-term than the executive branch is the judicial branch. So by a change in our legal system, I am mostly referring to the judicial branch, even though the executive branch is also out of kilter. We are no longer the same government that we used to be. We are not the government that we were set up to be. So we have a change in our judicial system, our legal system. First of all, we now have judicial law. What do I mean by judicial law? What I mean is the Supreme Court decides what happens in our country, not the laws passed by our legislature and even signed by our president. The Supreme Court. They decide what is legal and what is not legal, which of course affects what is right and what is wrong. Because of course we need our legal system, because right and wrong with our human nature has to be supported by the law. Okay, so judges decide right from wrong, what is legal or not legal. And then each time a decision is made, legal precedence is set. And now in our country, legal precedence is more important than constitutionality. So we have a problem with our legal system. Lots of problems with our legal system. The most long-term and the worst problem with our legal system is the power of the Supreme Court. Okay? We have judicial law. The Supreme Court decides what is legal and not legal. And by extension, then, they're able to decide what is considered right and wrong in our country. And the Supreme Court sets what is called legal precedence. And legal precedence is argued in court. Legal precedence is a reason many times to change what we decide is legal or not. Oh, there's a precedent set. Legal precedence is a big deal. So every time the Supreme Court makes a decision, legal precedence is set, and legal precedence is more and more taking over the idea of constitutionality. The way the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution is mind-blowing, okay? So we have judicial law. The second thing with our legal system, not only do we have judicial law setting legal precedents, all right, instead of going by constitutionality, we have what I'm going to call arbitrary law. So our legal system now has shifted to the Supreme Court. We have judicial law, not legislative law. And then number 2, we have arbitrary law. And we're still dealing with the Supreme Court. But why I'm calling it arbitrary law is the fact that we have 9 unaccountable individuals appointed to the Supreme Court for life. They have no accountability. They can decide whatever they want based on their own opinions and their own interpretations of what they say the Constitution says. So we have judicial law, meaning the Supreme Court has too much power. They decide what's legal and not legal. And we have arbitrary law. We've got these 9 individuals. How do you get off the Supreme Court? You retire or you die. Okay, and some of those people on there now need to retire. Okay, is there any way legally, I don't think so, that we can remove a person from the Supreme Court? Really hard and really tiny. Yes, it's not going to happen. So we have a change in our legal system. We have judicial law and we have arbitrary law. So the only way we will have legalized euthanasia becoming common practice is through our court system. Could it happen? Absolutely. Will it happen? Probably. I don't know. Okay? It'll probably be in your lifetime. Okay? We'll be deciding to end people's life at a certain stage after they reach a certain quality of life, etc. Okay, so the roots of abortion directly tied to evolution, right? It's a result of our shift in worldview, especially involving that first result, devaluation of human life, okay? And we are down the slippery slope because we recognize no higher law and we have had a radical change in our legal system, definitely since our country's founding. So that is the roots of euthanasia. That's how we got where we are, and that's how we are going to progress further, okay? In your lifetime, probably. You wouldn't believe the changes that have occurred in my lifetime, okay? From, I was in school in the 70s, college in the 80s, okay? And a lot of things have changed in my lifetime. Not for the better, okay? As a child, okay, in the 70s, I didn't know anybody that was divorced, okay? You say, well, you grew up at Fairhaven. Well, that's true, but not when I was young. I remember in public school, I was in 2nd grade, so that's a long time ago, and it made a very distinct impression on my mind. In public school here in Chesterton, one of my classmates was getting a divorce, okay? None of my classmates that I knew of were divorced. Everybody lived with their straightforward siblings in one home with their mom and their dad. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that the case in the United States now? I remember it was a big deal in our class. We were all talking about it, and we were all scared. Are my parents going to get a divorce? I didn't know anybody that didn't have mom, dad, siblings. Mom and dad married to each other. All this, and you know, I didn't know what step brother and sister was. Okay, and that was in the early 1970s. All right? Where are we now? We say, oh, well, the divorce rates aren't, the divorce rates have stabilized. Well, that's probably true, but why have the divorce rates stabilized? Nobody's getting married, okay? So be aware that things can change rather rapidly in your lifetime, okay? That's the slippery slope. Now I want to talk about what is euthanasia. We're talking about the roots of euthanasia. We're talking about the sanctity of human life and so on. But what is euthanasia? Let me give you a definition. Euthanasia is kind of a broad umbrella. So euthanasia is the premature ending the premature ending of the life of another with or without their consent due to a perceived lack of quality of life or a terminal illness. The premature ending of the life of another with or without their consent due to a perceived lack of quality of life or a terminal illness. Basically, it is the destruction of human life with some type of a justified reason. The premature ending of the life of another with or without their consent due to a preconceived lack of quality of life. Okay, there's active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. Most of what we're talking about here would be more passive. We have a justifiable reason. Okay? So that's the definition. Also, we are going to see a play on words or a masking of terminology. Play on words involving euthanasia. I think the first one that we hear is the idea of mercy killing. This one's not as bad. Mercy killing, basically saying you're killing someone to help them. You're being merciful to them. Mercy killing. Another one is assisted suicide. So we kind of made a progression from mercy killing to assisted suicide. Another code for euthanasia, death with dignity. So we have mercy killing instead of euthanasia. We have assisted suicide instead of murder. We have death with dignity. Okay, so that sounds even better than assisted suicide. Then we also have end of life case instead of what I call judicial murder. End of life case. This is where, of course, a court, and we're not talking jury, we're talking what? A judge. A single judge in most cases. Judicial murder, where a single judge decides who lives and who dies. A single judge will decide what is legal or not legal. That's judicial law. When I talked about it a few minutes ago, I was talking about the Supreme Court, but it isn't just the Supreme Court. Okay, the Supreme Court, and we'll be talking about Terri Schiavo in a minute, the Supreme Court did not hear the Terri Schiavo case. A federal judge in the state of Florida decided that Terri Schiavo should starve to death, which is what happened to her, okay? So play on words also is going to mask the idea of euthanasia. So we have mercy killing instead of euthanasia. We have assisted suicide then instead of mercy killing. We have end of life case instead of judicial murder. We have death with dignity instead of suicide. We have right to die. So in our end of life case, we're going to have a judge decide if a person has the right to die. If the person is not legally competent, we are going to decide about death with dignity, and we are going to decide their quality of life. All these little phrases, okay? Mercy killing, assisted suicide, death with dignity, right to die, end of life case, quality of life is an excuse to essentially get rid of somebody because they don't have a certain quality of life. Burden to society, we're going to be hearing that more and more, that a certain person or a certain group of people are a burden to society. It's too expensive. The treatment's not going to work anyways, so let's end their life. Okay, so euthanasia, what is it? It's when we end human life for a justifiable reason in our own minds. Okay? Two more things. First thing I want to talk about in specifics is the Terri Schiavo case. The Terri Schiavo case, which is a case of judicial murder. The Terri Schiavo case was decided by a single judge in the state of Florida, beginning in 1990, ending in 2005. 15-year legal battle over the life of Terri Schiavo. Okay, so the Terri Schiavo case, 15-year court battle from 1990 to 2005, where a single judge in the state of Florida decided that Terri should starve to death, literally. Okay. First of all, background. Background of the Terri Schiavo case. Who was Terri Schiavo? All right, so Terri Schiavo, in 1990, Terri Schiavo was a 26-year-old woman. For unknown cause, she went into cardiac arrest, stopped breathing in her home, was, of course, transported by ambulance. No cause for her cardiac arrest was determined. She was transported by ambulance to the hospital. However, she suffered irreversible brain damage due to lack of oxygen to her brain. All right, Terri Schiavo could breathe on her own. All of her she was severely brain damaged, we won't deny that. She was able to breathe on her own, heartbeat on her own, maintain all of her involuntary vital functions. She was able to see, move her limbs, respond. There's even reports that she, for a time, was able to say simple words as in yes and no. Her parents reported that, and the fact that she would even say, "Stop that," when, someone would be moving her arm or whatever. So she was not vegetative. She was not in a coma. Her eyes were open, she would blink, she'd turn her head, she would respond. She was severely brain damaged. Okay, so after a short amount of time, of course, Terri Schiavo was moved into a long-term nursing facility. In that long-term nursing facility, she initially was having physical therapy. She was not on life support. Do you understand what I mean by that? She was not on a heart-lung machine. She was not even trached. Okay? She was not on life support. She was on a feeding tube due to her inability to swallow. Okay? She was not on life support. She was on what's called a PEG tube, a feeding tube that supplied nutrition and hydration to her stomach directly, okay? Because she couldn't swallow and wanted to choke. All right, Terri's husband has always been a questionable figure, Michael Schiavo. A lot of this goes back to a malpractice suit, okay? Of course, anytime someone dies, they're going to go after the hospital and doctors involved and so forth. Another problem with our legal system. So there was a malpractice suit. And of course, certain amounts of money were set aside for Terri's care. Terri's parents, their last name was Schindler, of course. All kinds of legal battles going on, beginning with this unaccounted for cardiac arrest in 1990. So, background. Terri's legal case, first of all, really began in May of 1998. And a lot of this was going on in May of 1998. Michael Schiavo claimed that Terri wouldn't want to live in this state, and he wanted to have her feeding tube removed and Terri be allowed to die. Okay, and this was a judge, his name was George Greer, ruled in early 2000 that the feeding tube would be removed by court order. Of course, her parents fought this. Okay, so we're talking then 2000. Her parents wanted Michael Schiavo to divorce her. He did not want to do so. That ends his claim on the malpractice money, and that would end his claim on Terri Schiavo's estate, the money that was awarded to her. Apparently someone brought a wrongful death lawsuit. All right, and then the next thing that happened is March of 2005. We have all these legal battles. They're going to remove the feeding tube, put them back in, because another judge says, no, wait a minute, put the feeding tube back in until we decide this on a permanent basis. Then finally by March of 2005, U.S. District Judge James Whittemore signed the final order removing Terri's peg tube, her feeding tube. Okay. So the nursing facility withheld nutrition and hydration in compliance with this court order. 11 days later, March 31st, 2005, Terri Schiavo died of marked dehydration and starvation. She was also denied last rites. Now, obviously, we're not Catholic, and we don't believe in last rites, but to me, it's a big deal when things like that are denied, okay? She was denied last rites by her Catholic priest when her parents wanted him to come and administer that, which is should be her right? She should have the religious freedom to do so. Her parents wanted this to occur, being that they were devout Catholics. The priest was not allowed to enter the room because they were afraid he would give her try to give her some type of water and so forth. Okay, so Terri Schiavo was murdered by our judicial system in a very cruel manner. Okay, died of marked dehydration and starvation. So who was Terri Schiavo? She was a severely brain damaged woman who was denied nutrition and hydration. Okay, her parents wanted Michael Schiavo to divorce her. They wanted to be awarded care of her to allow her to continue her life. But the whole idea was, what kind of life is that in the nursing home? Well, our point is, it's not up to us to decide. If a federal judge can decide to deny nutrition to a brain damaged woman in a nursing home, what's the next step? So who was Terri Schiavo? She was a brain damaged woman on a feeding tube in long-term nursing care who was starved and dehydrated to death by court order in 2005. The last person I'll mention briefly is Brittany Maynard. She's an example of physician-assisted suicide. Brittany was diagnosed in April of 2014 with stage 4 terminal brain cancer. She decided to end her life before the brain tumor completely debilitated her. And then on November 1st, 2014, she took what was called She took what was called aid in dying medication prescribed for her by a physician, and she essentially overdosed on barbiturates on November 1st of 2014. Okay, and this is the state of Oregon. Brittany and she was 29 years old. Brittany and her husband moved from California to the state of Oregon, which has a death with dignity law. So it was perfectly legal for her to go to a physician and for him to assign prescription medication with which she ended her life. Okay, so we are out of time, but make sure you understand the fact that we do have absolutes and so forth. We will see you on Monday.